Welcome to the Bible and Science. This is Dave Prentice. I'm a retired public high school teacher, certified in all branches of science and math. I've also taught on the Bible and Science for many years, both in the U.S. and on many overseas mission trips. This is episode 46 of the Bible and Science. The last few episodes had to do with mammals and reptiles. We're going to continue on with that topic today. The question is, did mammals evolve from reptiles? And let me jump to the end and tell you the answer is no. Okay, so a lot of times people will say we creationists are not really doing good science and it's just all made up stuff. Well, I want to show you, these are some of the references that I'm using. I've read so many of these articles because I want to make sure that I'm not giving you just some wacko made up religious stuff. So if you go on the podcast homepage to episode info descriptions, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of these things and they're listed. You can copy them from the descriptions on the podcast homepage, plug them into your browser, and you'll see these are really real. Okay, when we go through all of these things, if you pay attention, you'll notice that the authors take for granted that the animals evolved over millions of years from one major type to another. And I've seen a number of statements that animals experimented with various types of structures, experimenting with the inner ear and so forth. That's ridiculous. Experimenting requires a conscious choice on the part of the experimenter. The possibility of design and of a supernatural designer is not even mentioned. This is just strictly from an atheistic perspective on almost all of these articles. So likewise, it's just taken for granted that the rock strata show animals and plants gradually evolving over millions of years. The possibility that many or most of the strata were produced during and or after large-scale catastrophes is not even mentioned. It's based upon the assumption of uniformitarianism, that is, everything happens at slow, steady, gradual rates. So I'm going to be using standard terminology, but I think if you've been watching for a while, you'll know I don't believe the standard terminology. I don't agree with those presuppositions, but the presuppositions are atheistic evolution and no flood. Why do we call something a mammal? Why is a mammal as compared to a reptile? Well, what puts the body structures in every living thing? DNA. It has the information needed to put them there. So let's contrast the characteristics of reptiles versus the mammals that they're supposed to have evolved into. With reptiles, all but one are cold-blooded. There's a tegu lizard that's a little different from the rest. And then reptiles are called polyphyodonts. That is, their teeth are continually replaced throughout life if they have teeth. Now, of course, turtles don't have teeth, but they're still categorized the same way. Reptiles have scales instead of hair. The lower jaw has 3 bones on each side. There's only 1 bone in the middle ear. There's no such thing as maternal care. The babies are abandoned as soon as they hatch. And the babies eat the same thing as adults. And then something we're going to focus on a good bit is called the organ of Corti in the hearing mechanism. They don't have any such thing. By contrast, mammals have certain characteristics. All known mammals are warm-blooded. That is, they match the temperature of their surroundings. And then mammals, if they have teeth, they only have 2 sets of teeth. They're diphyodonts. Throughout their life, they'll have the baby set and the adult set if they have teeth. But there are a number that don't have teeth. All mammals have hair. They only have 1 bone on each side of the lower jaw. They have 3 bones in the middle ear on each side. They have some rather elaborate maternal care. The babies are nursed by the mothers. The babies require milk. And the hearing mechanism in mammals depends upon the organ of corti in the inner ear. We'll get back to that a bit later. So if something is going to be a transition or a common ancestor between reptiles and mammals, its evolving descendants will have to go hundreds or thousands of opposite mutations. Okay, as I said, very few reptiles don't have teeth, and everybody thinks all mammals have teeth. Now, one of the ways that living things have been categorized is cynodonts and non-cynodonts. It means dog tooth. So rather than choosing warm-bloodedness, nursing or hair, cladists, those that are trying to categorize living things, they've chosen the arrangement of teeth as the most important way of deciding whether a fossil should be grouped with mammals or reptiles, that is, mammalian or non-mammalian cynodonts. I don't think that's necessarily the most sensible way to distinguish between various types. For instance, do all reptiles have teeth? Well, turtles don't. Are there any mammals that don't have teeth? Yes, platypuses have them at the very earliest stages after conception, but they lose them as they mature. And echidnas, called spiny anteaters, never have teeth. Neither do pangolins, anteaters, armadillos, or sloths. And whales, they have teeth, right? Except now there's a group of whales called baleen whales. They don't have teeth at all. So I think this is one way that God is showing us that he has a sense of humor. He made it very difficult for us to categorize these things. Okay, looking at the geologic timescale, and as I said, I don't accept these times, but that's okay. Supposedly, the reptiles first appeared in the Pennsylvanian with Hylonomus. That's the lowest known so-called stem reptile. But then the mammal-like reptiles, being closest to mammals, should be the most advanced types because mammals are considered more highly evolved than reptiles, but they're not. The Therapsid reptiles and the pelycosaurs, which are called mammal-like reptiles, occur millions and millions and millions of years too early on the geologic time scale to be considered the ancestors of the dinosaurs. So the reptiles are also called non-mammalian cynodonts because they have the kind of teeth, in some cases, similar to the teeth mammals have. But the non-mammalian cynodonts, the so-called mammal-like reptiles, they disappeared just about a little bit before the so-called earliest saurischians, those that have a lizard-type pelvis, and the non-mammalian cynodonts disappeared before any of the ornithischian dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are considered less advanced than the non-mammalian cynodonts, but yet they appear much, much later. Okay, now going over in the direction of the mammals, the creature that's considered now to be the oldest mammal, or it's claimed to be the oldest mammal, is called Brachyllodon. That one is there, not too, it's a good bit before the extinction of the non-mammalian cynodonts. And then Morganucodonts, we're going to talk about those a little bit, and it's tough to find the pronunciation of those. Morganucodonts, Morganucodonts. Well, I'm going to go with Morganucodonts because that's what I've heard pronounced more often, but I tried to look up the pronunciation. So anyway, these are named for a group called Morganucodonts, and one of those are claimed to be the earliest mammals, or they have been for a long time. And then there's a gap between those and some of the mammals that are found in the Cretaceous, in the Mesozoic. There are a few types of mammals monotremes and marsupials and some rodents are found in that same rock layer. But then there's an explosive appearance of modern mammals that's going to be found in the Pliocene, Pleistocene, something like that. And then primates, which is the group that we belong to, monkeys, apes, humans, those, they don't come along until supposedly about 60 million years or so. Now, of course, and this is also considerably after Archaeopteryx, the so-called ancestral bird. But these time periods shown on here are interpreted by creationists like me as not being time periods at all, but that the strata represent ecological communities rather than time periods. So according to evolutionists' initial disorganization, things go from simple to complex. The geologic column is divided into eras, periods, and epochs. Each represents a time period. So different things would have been evolving at different rates at different places and different locations and different times. There should be a continual overlap of life forms with no consistent worldwide patterns. Now, if you believe in creation, which is initial complexity, complex to simple, then each of the divisions of the geologic column would be believed to be an ecological community. They're identified by a characteristic group of fossils or a characteristic suite of fossils. So rather than there being multiple periods and epochs within the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic eras, the strata represent fossilized ecological communities that lived at the same time within a few thousand years of each other, but in perhaps radically different environments. So can I prove that? No. Can somebody else prove that it's millions and millions or billions of years? Nope, they can't do that either. I've talked earlier about the geologic timescale of it's not based on radiometric decay. It's just based instead on the assumption that evolution took place. So let's consider some of the major differences between reptiles and mammals. In reptiles, the lower jaw has got 3 bones on each side, the dentary, the angular, and the articular. As comparing that to a mammal, you've only got 1 bone, the dentary on both sides. So there would have had to be in intermediate stages going from the reptile type to the mammal type, and there would have to be a double jaw articulation, the place where the 2 bones meet up. In reptile middle ears, there's just 1 bone called the stapes, and it interacts with the hearing mechanism. It mounts on the quadrate. Now in mammals instead, you're going to have to go through a partial mammalian middle ear called the PMME, then a transitional mammalian middle ear, TMME, and finally a definitive mammalian middle ear. So the bones, the angular and articular of reptiles, would have to migrate to the opposite side of the eardrum. And it would also be moving from the lower to the upper jaw. So the animals wouldn't have had any kind of a hearing mechanism that we can identify. They would likely have been deaf during that transition. I'm trying to emphasize that in order for something to evolve, or some ancient line of animals to evolve from reptiles to mammals, there would have to be some major transitions going on in the skull, in the middle ear. And also we'll get to the hearing mechanism a bit later. But in order for any sort of reptile to evolve into any sort of mammal, the dentary, the angular, the articular of the lower jaw has to consolidate into a single bone. Why is it going to consolidate? Because of mutations in DNA. Okay, and then during the transitional period, during many generations, there would be 2 jaw hinges, the squamosal to dentary and the quadrate to articular. Now compare that to the mammal mammal versus reptile, jaws and inner ears and so forth, and middle ears. So while this is happening to the jaws, the articular and the quadrate has to move from the lower to the upper jaw and migrate across the eardrum. The articular has to turn into the malleus. The quadrate becomes the ingus. It's unclear how the animals would be able to hear during many, many, many generations it took for the bones to migrate across the eardrum. And of course, if you are refusing to believe the possibility of design, you get no choice but this. But I think that maybe there's an intelligent God that put the information in the DNA in order for these structures to appear. So how do mammals hear? It's similar, but a good bit different from the way reptiles hear. Okay, first, sound waves enter the outer ear. They vibrate the eardrum. That kind of sounds like a lot of reptiles. But then the eardrum is going to transfer the vibration to the middle ear by using 3 bones, not 1. It vibrates the malleus, commonly known as the hammer, and that in turn vibrates the incus, which is called the anvil, which in turn vibrates the stapes, called the stirrup, because that's what it looks like. It presses against the oval window on the cochlea in the inner ear, and it vibrates the fluid inside. Well, that is going to lead to some other things in hearing. We'll get into more detail a bit later. The basilar membrane on the bottom of the organ of corti inside the cochlea flexes, and then that makes the hair cells flex against the tectorial membrane. The flexing motion is converted to electrical signals, which are sent to the brain and interpreted as sound. This is done in the organ of corti. How many mammals have an organ of corti of one form or another? All of them. Even the monotremes, which are considered the lowest of the mammals, they do have an organ of corti. It's a bit different. It's not completely curled around like it is in the placental mammals, but it's still there. It's present. How many reptiles have an organ of corti? None. None is known with anything that could have been the source of this. Why is it present? Because DNA has the information necessary to put it there. So why would the mammalian hearing system evolve? DNA is responsible to manufacture and place every structure in every known living thing. Reptiles are limited to low frequency hearing because of the structure of their middle and inner ears, but they're supposed to have survived with that capability, low frequency only, for hundreds of millions of years. So if you watch Jurassic Park and the people didn't want to get eaten by the dinosaurs, they should have just talked in a very high-pitched voice, and then the dinosaurs could not have heard them. Well, somehow the reptiles are supposed to have survived for hundreds of millions of years with only low-frequency hearing. And then some sort of reptiles, such as the non-mammalian cynodonts, they're supposed to have acquired hundreds of thousands of beneficial mutations. This would rework the jaws and also move the bones to the middle ears. And as the bones were moving over many generations, it would most likely have produced deafness in the animals. So finally, the DNA evolved to produce an excellent high-frequency hearing system involving the new organ of corti. It had to happen at least 3 separate times. For monotremes, for marsupials, the pouched animals, and the placentals, which is the rest of the mammals. All of this would have to happen in spite of the elaborate error-correcting mechanisms in DNA reproduction. If you go back to a much earlier episode, I talked about what DNA does and how errors are prevented. There's an elaborate mechanism. Such a thing as this just would not happen. Okay, so again, I'm showing you this is where reptiles and mammals are placed on the geologic time scale. So there has to be some sort of a transition going from the non-mammalian cynodonts, the reptiles, to the mammals. Okay, the one that's very often proposed is Morganucodon, and it's tough to pronounce because you can't find a definitive pronunciation online. The Morganucodonts are a group of fossil genera from the Upper Triassic. They're dated to about 205 million years ago. They're claimed to be transitional forms between reptiles and mammals. The group gets its name from Morganucodon, which means Glamorga tooth, first identified in Glamorgan, Wales. Morganucodons also include several other genera such as Kuehneotheriidae and Erythrotherium. They're considered similar enough to belong to the same subclass. Now, if you've gone to a museum in the last few years, you'll probably see Morganucodon. It's a shrew-sized animal weighing less than an ounce. When I went to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., it was prominently displayed as the ancestor of all mammals. It was claimed to have had a double-jointed jaw structure, intermediate between that of reptiles and that of mammals. So the museums are going to show artists' conceptions, but almost no fossils on which those reconstructions are based. Why is that? Because the fossil evidence is extremely scarce. There are over 1,000 teeth known, but there are no complete body fossils, no complete jaw fossils, and only a few fairly complete skull fossils from China. Except for those few partial skulls, the fragments are nowhere near complete, and almost all of the known bones are broken apart. They're disarticulated. So I'm going to show you a list of a bunch of different species or a bunch of different genera. What is a species? To a biologist, species and genera are groups whose members cannot breed with any other group. However, how are you going to test this? What sort of experiment are you going to do on a fossil to see if it could breed with a different fossil? You can't. You can't do breeding experiments on extinct animals. So the researchers have to simply guess whether they belong to different species based on how different the specimens seem to be. So, could two things with dissimilar bones belong to the same species? Well, you might have seen Andre the Giant in The Princess Bride. You might have seen Vern Troyer in some of the Austin Powers movies. You look at them, you say, oh man, that can't even be the same genus. Yes, they're both Homo sapiens. There's individual variation within the specimens of Homo sapiens. So how can you tell whether the differences in extinct creatures mean they belong to extinct species or just showed normal variation within the same species? Look at these two. They're the same species, but there's an amazing amount of variation between the two of them. So these are some of the Morganucodonts. The bones of the middle ear support the lower jaw to enable biting and chewing. You don't chew the same way a reptile does. You can move your jaw back and forth, left to right, as well as just up and down. And there would have to be some ancient animals that would have to gradually evolve mammalian middle ears. They'd have to go through a partial mammalian middle ear, PMME, then a transitional middle ear, TMME, finally end up with a definitive MME, DMME. So there have been a number of genera found, identified based on tiny, tiny fragmentary evidence. They're found in the Triassic through Cretaceous at several places around the world. These are often presented as transitions from reptiles to mammals, or else, even if they're not transitions, as close relatives of the transitions. They're collectively known as the Morganucodonts, named for Glamorgan in Wales, where they were first discovered. And the whole thing, the whole group is called that because Morganucodon is supposed to best exemplify the characteristics of the Morganucodon. Sorry, that's a hard word to keep saying over and over. So these things supposedly came along in hundreds of millions of years ago, and they would supposedly be either a transition or at least a close relative of the transition. Well, okay, how many of these do we have a complete body fossil of? Zero. How many do we have a complete jaw fossil of? Zero. We take what we have, little bitty pieces and parts, and we fill in the rest through imagination. There are a great many of these fossil species that are based on imagination. A species consists of a large group of individuals that are defined by their ability to interbreed. A genus is a larger group than a species. So in many cases of extinct animals, very few fossils are available. Sometimes in the study of the alleged ancestors of mammals and humans and other groups that are especially interesting in the creation-evolution controversy, an entire species or an entire genus has been described just on little bitty fragments of just a few individuals. Later on, we'll get to some of the so-called transitions from ape to human, and it's laughable. So the total evidence, in some cases, this applies not just to the primates evolving to humans, but from reptiles to mammals. In some cases, the total evidence has come from a single individual. This is the case with the alleged transition from reptiles to mammals. Many times it's one individual, little pieces and parts. So here's the fossil evidence for Morganucodon. How many complete body fossils do we have? None. There's not a complete single body fossil of any one of the named species of Morganucodon. There are a few that have fairly complete skulls, upper skulls, but there's not even a single complete lower jaw, not even one. The fossil reproduction you'll see in most museum displays, it's a single fragment of a lower jawbone, shown at the upper right. It's less than an inch long, from the Pontyloon quarry at Glamorgan in Wales. It was embedded in the sedimentary rock, too fragile to remove. Only one side is visible. It was given the species name Morganucodon watsoni. We have thousands of teeth of Morganucodon, but very few fossils of other parts. 7 lower jaw fragments were found at Glamorgan, but not a single complete lower jaw. And there are also some parts that are claimed to be from pre-articular bones, which are found in reptiles but not mammals. They were all tiny. The whole jaw size was similar to European molds. All of the bones of Morganucodon at Glamorgan, thought to be from the angular, were broken. We don't have a single complete dentary, lower jaw, not one single one. So there's been a grand total of 1 fragmented bone that's been claimed to be from an articular complex, which is found in reptiles but not mammals. But because the skulls are so fragmented, the lengths of the skulls are estimates only. Complete upper skulls are rare. There have been several found in the red bends of the lower Lufeng Formation in China in a different species, Morganucodon oleri. But prior to 1995, there was only a single specimen known. But in that year, somebody found another single new skull. It had complete upper dentition, that is the skull, but no parts from the lower jaw. It was crushed. Nevertheless, it was considered sufficient to justify a new description of the species as having a quadrate articular joint, which is a characteristic of reptiles. However, the lower jaw was separate from the skull and fractured into multiple segments. There have been 3 other species identified or named in the genus Morganucodon. They've been assigned in China, Switzerland, and France, but they're all based only on fragments of skulls and teeth. So is it really a transition? Well, the great majority of Morganeucodon fossils are isolated teeth. Some of the available jaw and skull fragments have been used to put together reconstruction showing a double jaw articulation like what you see at the right. But did you know that juvenile monotremes, the platypus, the echidna, they go through a transitional stage that looks like that, where they're not fully matured yet. They've hatched from their eggs, but they go through a transitional stage and they are deaf during that time. They have a double jaw articulation. Now, Morganucodon is generally believed to have laid eggs, which is a characteristic typical of monotremes. If so, the fossils showing an articulation like that could very well have been juveniles buried during embryonic development rather than adults. If they weren't completely developed, they would have still had the double jaw joints. Remember, we have no complete head or body fossils. They're all broken into fragments. They're all deposited in water-laid sediment with indications that the fragments were transported by flowing water after death. Well, this looks to me like it's consistent with flood conditions. The bones from the skull and jaw are not found worldwide, only two places, a small area of Wales and a small area of China. A little collection of bones in each place. It could even be a litter. There are only a small number of specimens in each location. They're all tiny and they're all roughly the same size. So it looks to me like it may be that the scientists digging in Wales and digging in China might have uncovered a trove, a litter of some sort of prehistoric monotreme. We don't have the complete details on this, but I think it's very bold to say that this is a transition between reptile and mammal. I think that we should suspend further judgment. In the next episode, we're going to start talking more in detail about the reptile versus mammal hearing, and in particular of this amazing structure called the organ of Corti that I think just totally blows away the idea of evolution from reptile to mammal.